This is your daily dose of all things royal.
I guess the educator, the facilitator, creating a space where people feel as though they can speak and where language, where needed, has to be corrected. Because I think fundamentally one of the things that's really interesting about these kind of different contexts is that they all fundamentally prepare students to take their place within society. So we live in a diverse, hyper-diverse, multicultural society. And one of the things that I think is really, really important around that is providing people with a toolkit to navigate that society in the world of work. And increasingly, for whatever reason, we seem to be digressing in that area. And you can kind of make a direct correlation between political correctness being a thing, you know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, and now free speech almost being weaponized to demonize particular intersectional groups.
Cambridge University's youngest black professor just quit. Not after some quiet internal review, not after a polite disagreement over footnotes. He quit after his entire fairy tale collapsed in public. Jason Arday, the man sold to the UK as living proof that identity plus adversity equals genius, is now gone. And the part that should make every single one of us furious is not just the plagiarism, the invented charity millions, the impossible athletic feats, or the visiting professorships that never existed. It's how long the UK institutions protected him, how quickly the race card was played, and how familiar this pattern now feels. Because we've seen this movie before. Remember Claudine Gay at Harvard, as well as George Barronay, who was the president of the Oxford Union Debating Society? And we watched a longer, more glamorous version of it play out for years with Meghan Markle. Different stages, same operating system, but same result. Achievement by identity and narrative, protection by institutional fear, and their truth elevated above the truth until the contradictions now become impossible to ignore. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened with Jason Arday, why the parallels with this woman we are calling Meghan Markle are not coincidental, and how we reach the point in history where fantasists can ride victimhood and DEI all the way to the top of elite institutions, until the evidence becomes so overwhelming that even the protectors now have to look away. If you're interested in understanding how grifters like these were able to con the world, stay with me, because this video is going to give you some insight into the minds of these Marxist fantasists conning the world. Before we get started, if you could help the kid out and hit that like button, and also double check to make sure that you're still subscribed, because we know how YouTube loves to play jokes on this channel. All right, let's get started with the story this fantasist told everyone.
I always felt it was a privilege to have a period of 11 years where I couldn't speak and I couldn't converse in a way that everyone else could, because it allowed me to see things in a different way.
Professor Jason Arday was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at the age of 3. He couldn't speak until he was 11 and read or write until he was 18. Throughout his early years, his parents continued to believe in him.
At 18, my mum had got to a point where there was only so much she could do, and she was brilliant, even though she had this belief that, you know, he'll do something okay, but she was just decided, I need someone else to believe in him as much as I believe in him.
Therapists predicted he would need full-time assistance throughout his life. How wrong they were.
You okay?
It was this man, college tutor Sandro Sandri, who helped teach Jason to read and write at 18.
I'm just so happy for him. You know, I'm speechless, to be honest. But I never doubt a moment they would achieve where he is.
Sandro would spend hours of his free time teaching Jason.
There's one thing you said to me which I never forgot, and it was when I was 22, and I said to you I was thinking about doing a PhD, and you said to me, like, you know, it would be the greatest story in the world if the kid who didn't know how to read and write was managed to get a PhD, like, and you said, like, I think, you know, we can take on the world, or you can take on the world and you can win, and I never forgot that.
Then in 2023, Jason is appointed Professor of Sociology of Education at Cambridge at the young age of 37, the youngest Black professor in the university's history. For the UK, this guy was essentially the poster child for their DEI Diversity is Our Strength campaign and propaganda, pushing this neo-Marxism.
Here's his new boss at Cambridge.
We do have a lot of work to do, but I feel really optimistic. I think
Part of his research will look at new ways to make higher education more accessible for everyone.
What can we do to ensure that this isn't a market appointment in 5 years' time? How can this become the norm?
we've listened to the voices of our Black scholars and our Black students, and some of it has not been easy to hear, to be honest. But we're able to face up to some of the structural issues that people face.
There will be those that think this is a tokenistic appointment. What are your thoughts on this?
The board of electors on your interview day were absolutely unanimous. We are so lucky to have you. You are the best in the world in terms of the research that you do.
An extraordinary journey, but for Jason, this is not an end. It's a beginning.
The reaction has been amazing, and I'm truly grateful to everyone for their kind sentiment and kind words. We've got a lot of work to do.
Celestina Olulode, BBC News, Cambridge.
A philosopher named Nathan Kovnas published a detailed breakdown showing large sections of Arday's 2015 PhD thesis were identical or near identical to an earlier thesis by another academic. We're talking well over 100 passages this guy copied. Not loose paraphrasing, pretty much swiped it word for word. And how did Cambridge react to this? Call the scrutiny a vile campaign to undermine his credibility. Liverpool, John Moores, which awarded the PhD, claimed it was mostly, quote-unquote, honest and reasonable error. Autism was offered as an explanation, using the excuse that he absorbs information through mimicry, apparently. Then more evidence landed. Quotes that appeared to be recycled or lifted from other researchers' work started coming out. False funding claims, claims of visiting professorships at places like Ohio State and Nelson Mandela University that the institutions themselves denied. A book he listed as published that was never actually published, and charity fundraising numbers that started at over £5 million, raised largely by him, and later quietly became part of a syndicate about 100 people I can't name because of NDAs. Extreme running claims like running 600 miles in 6 days, 30 marathons in 35 days, including 9 with a broken leg, that got revised downward once journalists started to ask questions. So this guy also made these dramatic claims of threats, saying masked men with knives at his faculty building, a pig's head delivered to his parents. Turns out the police records and CCTV did not match any of the stories that this guy told. But here's where it gets even more revealing. When Jack Grove, a journalist at Times Higher Education, did the most basic thing a reporter is supposed to do, which was email Arday a series of questions about his academic record and offer him right of reply, the response was not clarification. It was legal firepower and police involvement.
Got to challenge you on this one. The Metropolitan Police is accused of press censorship for investigating a journalist who tried to expose a Cambridge professor who's alleged to have committed plagiarism. Jack Grove, a reporter for the Times Higher Education. A 4-month investigation. Why was that necessary, Commissioner?
We dropped the ball on that one, Nick. Let's not sort of beat about the bush. A report came in, I think it was of harassment or some crime like that. It should have been screened out earlier on as not requiring investigation.
When you say screened out, it should have been one phone call. Yeah, no further action.
Nothing requiring police action. It's sort of sat on an officer's workload and he made a couple of phone calls, which in hindsight, we shouldn't have done that. So the big organisation will make the odd mistake.
Apology to the reporter involved?
Yeah, we shouldn't have made that call to him and said that.
Finally, we finish on a very...
Arday's lawyers at Carter Ruck suggested the inquiries may be racially motivated. So a harassment complaint was made to the Metropolitan Police. Officers spent 4 months investigating this journalist. They never even interviewed this guy, but when they finally contacted Grove, it was to tell him the case was closed and that he should not contact Arday again because the questions had affected this professor's mental health. As we just heard, the Met Commissioner later admitted his force dropped the ball and should never have investigated, but the message had already been sent. Legitimate journalistic scrutiny of a public academic's record was treated as a potential crime, and the race card was deployed to chill it. But then, on August 6, after Cambridge finally announced it was investigating new information about Arday's qualifications and honorary appointments, Arday decided to resign with immediate effect. He maintained he was not a liar and framed the scrutiny as racially motivated. For now, Arday's grift is over. But the question is why it lasted as long as it did, and why even the police were briefly recruited to protect it. You see, this is not an isolated case of one man's embellishments. This phenomenon we are watching is a system. And Meghan Markle is the most successful practitioner of that system in modern celebrity culture. Pay attention to the structural similarities carefully because they're not subtle. Both constructed a powerful origin story that mixed genuine difficulty with dramatic elevation. Arday's was the autistic child who couldn't speak until 11 and somehow became a Cambridge professor, and Meghan, she was this mixed-race girl from a broken home who overcame Hollywood discrimination and a cold, racist royal family to become a global figure fighting systemic injustices. In both cases, the narrative did the heavy lifting. The actual record of achievement was secondary to the emotional power of their stories. You see, in this case, both of these two grifters received institutional protection that ordinary people never get. Cambridge's first instinct was to denounce critics rather than examine this guy's work. The Royal Institution, for a time, managed and amplified Meghan Markle's preferred version of events and history. Media outlets that should have applied normal journalistic scrutiny instead treated the narratives as sacred. Questioning these stories was framed as an attack on the person and, crucially, as an attack on what that person represented. Both of these people deployed the race card as a defensive weapon the moment any scrutiny intensified. When Arday's plagiarism and biographical claims came under pressure, the response was that the questions were racially motivated and ableist. When Meghan's claims about the royal family, her early life, and her treatment inside the institution were challenged by contemporaneous evidence, family statements, and just using our own eyes and reading what she's putting out there, the response was the same. Any disagreement was rooted in racism. The accusation itself became their shield. It forced institutions and journalists to calculate the professional costs of pursuing the truth. Remember, Piers Morgan got fired over questioning whether or not Meghan was suicidal, which to this day he had every right to express that he didn't believe her, like so many others. Both of these fantasists elevated the so-called my truth or their truth above verifiable fact. Arday's defenders treated his lived experience and autism as explanations that somehow softened or excused the documented problems in his academic work. Meghan, on the other hand, has made an entire public identity out of the idea that her personal narrative overrides records, timelines, and other people's testimony. Once my truth is granted moral priority, evidence becomes optional and contradiction becomes proof of the other side's bad faith. Both of them benefited from a climate in which challenging the preferred identity narrative carried social and professional risk. Academics who raised quiet concerns about Arday's work early on were ignored or sidelined. Journalists and commentators who questioned Meghan's version of events were branded as racist, obsessed, or part of a coordinated hate campaign. The fear of that label kept many people silent long after the gaps in the stories were so incredibly obvious that, Meghan likely was probably laughing the whole way to the bank. In Arday's case, that fear even reached the police, who spent months investigating a reporter for just simply asking questions. Somewhat of a bright side, both ultimately saw their narratives erode under the weight of accumulated evidence. Arday's resignation came only after the contradictions became too numerous and too public for Cambridge to keep defending. Meghan's carefully curated image has suffered the same slow attrition, not from one single devastating revelation, but the steady accumulation of inconsistencies that no amount of victimhood framing can permanently suppress. And now what we're seeing are headlines that literally their last resort is to finally come forward and just apologize for all of the harm that they've caused. Now, are they just throwing that headline out there? Probably. I mean, we are 6 years after the fact. Now they're going to want to apologize? Come on. Actually, it's not even an apology. It's just admitting that they caused enormous pain to the people in the institution. We know Meghan's not one for apologies. She's still going to double down on how she was wronged by this racist royal institution. Now, the only difference between Meghan and Arday is one of stage and scale. You see, Arday was elevated inside academia under the banner of DEI. Meghan, on the other hand, was elevated on the global stage under the banners of race, gender, and progressive virtue. The mechanism, though, is identical. Identity supplies the moral authority, victimhood supplies the emotional leverage, and institutional fear of being called racist supplies their protection. You see, and Harry's role in enabling this is not incidental. Just as academic allies and administrators protected Arday past the point of any kind of reason, Harry's willingness to endorse and amplify every element of Meghan's narrative, including the most obvious and contested claims, prolonged the life of this damn saga. The partner becomes part of the protective machinery, whether he wants to or not. This is why the comparison here matters. It's not about personal animosity. It's about recognizing a repeatable pattern in which institutions abandon normal standards of evidence and merit when the right identity and the right hardship story are presented. Once that happens, fantasists and grifters like Meghan and this guy Arday gain an enormous structural advantage. So the big question we have here is, why does this keep working? Well, the reason is because once an institution adopts the premise that proportional representation by race and identity is itself a form of justice, ordinary standards become secondary. It's that simple. Merit is redefined as whatever advances the preferred demographic outcome. The person who fits the desired identity category and can supply a compelling hardship narrative is not just hired or platformed, they're celebrated. Questioning the quality of the work or the accuracy of the biography becomes a moral failing rather than a professional responsibility. This is why we have this problem. Because fear then does the rest. In the post-2020 climate, especially after the institutional capture that followed the death of George Floyd and the Biden regime, accusing someone of racism became a near-nuclear option. Careers, funding, social standing, and even personal safety could be damaged by the charge. Academics, journalists, and administrators learned that the safer path was silence or active defense of the narrative. And this is what we saw with Meghan. This is why anybody that challenged Meghan Markle, they were called racist, and then there was an onslaught of attacks from these Marxists, Antifa-type terrorists. That's what they were. So what we have here is The result is a selection process that rewards the ability to perform victimhood and identity fluency more than it rewards rigorous, original, honest scholarship or consistent personal history. So when we try to understand how we reached to this point of absurdity, you have to recognize that this has been a slow corrosion of standards over the past decade. Critical race theory and its derivatives moved from the margins into HR departments, university administrations, media newsrooms, and even royal communication strategies. The idea that truth is relative to power and that lived experience trumps over data became respectable. Elite institutions, terrified of being called insufficiently progressive, began treating demographic checkboxes and compelling personal stories as substitutes for excellence and verifiable achievement. Once that door opened, people who understood the new rules walked through it and abused it. Look no further than to Barack Obama. He's the one that really planted those Marxist seeds into this country, calling it democracy. And because the climate of fear is real, people self-censor. Journalists hesitate. Universities issue defensive statements before the evidence is even examined. Media organizations, as we see with Meghan and Harry, protect certain narratives long after the contradictions are public. Even the police can be drawn in, as we saw when a journalist asking basic questions about a public academic's record was investigated for months and then warned off further contact. The race card is not just played by the individual. Understand, it is institutionalized. And when the individual is eventually exposed, the institutions that elevated them suddenly discover the need for further investigation. Only after the public pressure becomes unbearable. What did the institution do when it became public that Meghan was bullying staff members? Oh, all of a sudden now they opened up an investigation. After public scrutiny, now the palace is going to take action. But they weren't taking action when Meghan was bullying people, during her time as a so-called royal, right? This is how fantasists, or I like to call them pathological liars, arise. Not because every person from a minority background is fraudulent. That's like an absurd and false claim. But because the system has created incentives and protections that make it easier for narratives to outrun verification when the narrative is identity aligned. The cost here is not abstract, okay? When Cambridge appoints someone as a professor on the strength of a story that later unravels, every legitimate scholar who actually did the hard work without the same identity advantage is now diminished. When Harvard's leadership is chosen partly on symbolic grounds and then collapses under basic academic standards, the university's claim to excellence is also damaged. And here, when you talk about this global celebrity builds an empire on my truth while demanding the rest of us suspend disbelief about basic facts, trust in shared reality then goes out the window. And this is why you can't believe a thing that is being reported now about this couple and what's going on with this stupid saga. Thank God Trump won and got rid of all that DEI shit. We truly are living through a moment where achievement is increasingly treated as a function of identity and narrative rather than of demonstrated ability and honesty. That's not considered progress. It's actually a regression into a new form of aristocracy. I think the only way out of this is the reassertion of a single standard. Plagiarism, like we've seen Meghan do, as well as Arday, is plagiarism, regardless of the author's race or diagnosis. Fabricated achievements are exactly that, fabrications. Visiting professorships either existed or they did not. Charity totals either add up or they don't. Claims about institutional racism either withstand evidence or they do not. And my truth is not a substitute for the truth when the two conflict. And we need to stop with making up excuses for, oh, maybe they meant this. Look, Meghan Markle is a proven liar. We shouldn't be afraid to call her that. In order for us to take back control of society, we need to get to a place where society sees merit not as bigotry, and that demanding evidence is not hate, and that the refusal to treat every identity-aligned claim as automatically sacred is not racist. Now, a big reason as to why I did this video is because I want people to understand how this subversion and infiltration of Marxists from Cuba has been undermining not only America, but the West. Y'all remember this report that I showed you from the State Department called Cuba, the Capital of 21st Century Communism? You know, if you don't recall, it argues that while the old Soviet version of Marxism was mainly about rich versus poor, Castro's Cuba created something very different, and it's been playing out over decades. They shifted this fight from economic class to race, culture, and civilization itself. And, you know, the big enemy, as far as Cuba was concerned, became the West, especially America. And in their story, Black Americans and other minorities inside the United States were not just workers, they were colonized people living inside the empire, part of the same global struggle as revolutionaries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So this morphed into this new ideology, treated Western standards of truth, merit, and evidence with suspicion, right? It elevated the lived experience and the victim narrative of the preferred groups above cold facts. And it taught that challenging those narratives was itself a form of oppression. You know, Safiya Noble's algorithms of oppression. This is the intellectual and political soil we are standing in today. It's why a Cambridge professor's dramatic life story and identity credentials could protect him for so long, even as the evidence of plagiarism and embellishment piled on up. It is why institutions reach for the race card so quickly. It is why their truth is treated as more important than the actual truth. And it is why we keep seeing people elevated and shielded on the basis of the narrative they supply rather than the record they can actually defend. And you notice they never defend anything. I think what people are not fully getting here is that as we stare communism in its face, as it's here, the Soviet model largely died. But the Cuban influence version, built around identity grievances, anti-Western resentment, and the power of the victim story, didn't. It moved into our universities, the activist networks, and eventually the institutions that now run so much of our cultural and academic life. And that's a huge problem that we are facing right now. And what we're witnessing with Jason Arday is not an isolated scandal. It is the predictable result of an ideology that has been working for decades to replace objective standards with identity and narrative power. And that's where I'll leave you here to think about, because how do we reverse what's going on right now? Because everything seems so captured. You know, it really does bother me when I see Meghan and Harry preying on the vulnerable youth. This radical leftist indoctrination is harmful, and Meghan and Harry are part of the grooming that is taking place. Take, for example, this recent Q&A with Meghan and the Girl Scouts. Sure, on the surface, if you didn't know anything about Meghan, it would seem harmless. But when you look closer at the clips that they played in between with the Girl Scouts, I think it's very concerning to see clips of Barack Obama and then the Girl Scouts marching through in a gay pride parade, especially with people who are wearing minor attracted person flags. And you know what that stands for. I think it's unacceptable that the Girl Scouts are allowing these little girls to march in an LGBTQIA plus parade. And this is what I mean when I say institutions. It's organizations like this that have been captured. The only way that we're going to be able to reverse this is not only taking control back of our children, because these people have too much control and influence over them. Meghan and Harry have no business influencing any of the youth. They shouldn't. And the only way that this is going to be reversed is we have to gut this out of the institutions, which means people need to be more active in the community. And when I say more active, like there are councils that you can be a part of. Stand up and speak out against this. Parents need to take control back of the education system because the government shouldn't be putting down a curriculum where indoctrination of CRT, this, critical race theory being mandatory in a lot of schools, as well as this gender ideology shit. And I think most importantly, we need to get back to church. And we also need to get back to family values, not this, independent boss girl entrepreneur shit that Meghan is pushing these girls to pretty much not see traditional family values as something of stability and of worth to pursue. And this is what I don't like about what Cookie Queens is all about and what Meghan is peddling here. As harmless as it may look, it's not harmless. There is an agenda. Anyway, I know that I've been going on for 30 minutes. What do you guys think? Do you see how destructive this agenda has been? What do you think it's going to take to reverse this? Do you think that we are too far gone? I mean, it's been decades that this indoctrination has been happening. I'd love to know your thoughts. Definitely leave them below. And as always, I will be back with more content. But until then, please be safe, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Such a fraud.